Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at thechangeleader.com. This episode of Changing Higher Ed is sponsored by Perdea Education, a national leader in online student recruitment and enrollment services, providing institutions enrolled students risk-free on a performance-based model with no long-term contract. If your online programs could benefit from incremental online student enrollments, visit PerdeaEducation.com. That's P-E-R-D-I-A education.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Dr. Ashley Finley, Vice President of Research and Senior Advisor to the President for the Association of American Colleges and Universities. Ashley has had a long career in higher education, including at AAC&U, where she was the National Evaluator for the Bringing Theory to Practice project. She's also been Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean at Dominican University of California, and has also been at Dickinson College. AAC&U just published the study, How College Contributes to Workforce Success, Employer Views on What Matters Most. And Ashley, as author and principal investigator, joins us today to discuss its implication on higher education curriculum and what employers want to see in college graduates. Ashley, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Drumm. It's great to be with you.
Oh, I've been looking forward to this. You guys at AAC&U just came out with a new study on how colleges contribute to workforce success, and you take it from the employer views of what really matters. Tell us about the study.
Well, we have been conducting employer research since about 2007. And I think one of the things that we learned the most after doing this for the past 6 years or so is just how much we need to be thinking about the different employer views, how we need to be thinking about how the world has changed. And of course, this study has been shaped tremendously by the pandemic and how employer responses have changed as a result of that.
Well, I didn't see on any of the responses Zoom literacy.
No, that's correct. We should have been prescient enough to have asked about that. That would have been smart. But certainly oral communication tends to rank high.
Doesn't it always, though?
It does. It does.
So you conducted the survey in October of last year, 2020.
Correct.
Partnership with Hanover Research, who you've worked with before. Tell us a little bit, and I'm going to put on my academic hat now. We're going to use some academic terms. Tell us about your sample.
So we looked at 250 CEOs and 250 hiring managers for about a total sample of 500. We ended up with a sample of 496 because it is 2021, and we had a few bots that snuck into the sample, unfortunately. So,
what bots?
After kicking out the bots, after kicking out the non-human respondents, we did still have a robust sample of 496. And I will add for the listeners that since 2018, we last conducted the study in 2018, we had long been looking at C-suite executives. And in 2018, we wisened up, I think, a little bit, and we got a little bit more thoughtful about the sample in hypothesizing that we should at least have perspectives of those that we might say are C-suite executives, but we also want the perspectives of the hiring managers, the people kind of on the ground making those decisions, at least as part of the sample. And in case we actually saw some daylight between those two groups, and it would be just as important to understand what their comparative values were in terms of what they think about higher education and how they think about it contributing to workforce success. I will add for your listeners that in 2018, just as we found again in our 2020 group, there was very few and no significant trend differences between hiring managers and employers in their views on the skills necessary for success in the workforce or even how they valued the degree.
That's interesting, and that surprises me.
it surprised us. It surprised us, and we will keep examining. I think we will keep constructing the sample that way, but we still find over time that we're not, so far anyway, we are not seeing significant differences between those two groups. Pretty good alignment.
Yeah. And that, again, that's fascinating to me. But I wonder if that has anything to do with the types of organizations you looked at.
It could be. Again, part of the reason that we work with a research partner is that they are able to develop representative samples and panels of employers. And so we had a pretty nice cross section, predominantly for-profit companies. We did some nonprofits, but it was ended up being a relatively small proportion of the sample. If anything, we were slightly overrepresented among tech companies. But when we asked employers, we call them sort of inclusively employers. So you're going to hear my language used inclusively throughout this because we didn't see many differences between C-suite executives and hiring managers. When we asked employers to identify their industry, it was a multi-response category. So they could effectively choose multiple areas in which their company exists. And we did have some overrepresentation in technology, but not in a way that we felt really skewed the sample.
Well, that's interesting. And also, too, your sample represented organizations at which a minimum of 25% of entry-level positions are required. They require an associate's or a bachelor's degree.
Correct. That's correct.
And we are seeing a trend now where corporations, businesses are not requiring people to have college degrees.
No, but I do think other kinds of research organizations, Georgetown, I'll give a shout out to Georgetown Center on Education and the Workforce, which does just fantastic work in this area by looking at national statistics, Bureau of Labor Statistics, Dictionary of Occupational Titles, has done a tremendous job of identifying workplace trends. And we know that increasingly jobs will require, and we certain kinds of careers, or that path to a middle class wage, if you will, is going to increasingly require some kind of a college credential.
Mm-hmm. Credential or degree.
Correct. Yes.
So CCNU, one of the things that we talked about before was the difference between a liberal arts education and a liberal education. And I think that really reflects a lot on your results of this survey and what you were looking to get.
Mm-hmm. Well, so the mission of AAC&U is that we are an association dedicated to the belief in all students having access to a liberal education. And that is a philosophy of education in which students have gained the skills, the broad skills that are transferable across multiple dimensions, are applied, and help students to navigate an increasingly complex and diverse world. The liberal arts pertains to a set of disciplines, but we believe all disciplines contribute to a liberal education. So all disciplines are part of a liberal education, but not all disciplines are part of the liberal arts.
And that makes perfect sense. At the Naval Academy, we used to call them the bull subjects, history, languages, things like that. And at the Academy, by statute, 80% of all graduates had to have technical degrees, STEM degrees.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
But, and I was a physics major, so, I was, geek city. But we had minors, naval science, whatever it was, but we also had to take other courses as well, English courses, literature courses, political science. Most of those were electives, but it really went to that concept that you're talking about with a liberal education, which to me is another way of saying a well-rounded education.
I think that's perfectly said. And quite frankly, anytime we put the language of well-rounded in front of employers, we see high levels of agreement on that being considered necessary for success. By the way, I would add, when we put the language of should technical skills be part of the college education, they also tend to rate that very highly as well. So it's never, and we found this again consistently over the studies we've conducted over the years, that employers don't parse the difference between a well-rounded versus technical. It's not one or the other. They tend to be almost perfectly, not split, but saying it should be both.
Hmm.
And increasingly, like when we ask what are the aspects of a college education that best prepare students for a long-term career success, they are absolutely balancing the qualities of breadth and depth.
And it's so critical, and that really reflects in the results that you got. If we take a look at that liberal education, your top three things for the survey this time: the ability to work in teams, the
Mm-hmm.
ability to think critically, and the ability to analyze and interpret data. I mean, those
Yep.
were your top three results.
And honestly, one of the consistent things that we've asked over the years is for employers to not quite rank, but we do ask them to sort of rate the importance of various skills. And I would say they consistently, we ask them across about 15 different skills, and they all rate very highly in terms of importance. So I sometimes joke about why we would have a horse race in between learning outcomes to see which one wins, because they're all important. But this last time we conducted the survey in 2018, oral communication topped the list. This time, teamwork, but there's also another section of the report that does a comparison between 2018 and 2020. We just see great consistency over time. Critical thinking, any kind of communication skills, constantly in the mix.
Mhm. And it's interesting because in 2018, the ability to work independently was higher up. And then we come into the pandemic and everybody's working independently for at
That's
least a little
correct.
while.
That's correct. That's correct. But it's also shown, and I should have added when I was rattling off what's most consistent, the ability to work with others, the ability to work with diverse others is consistently rated highly. And so it didn't surprise us really that teamwork topped the list. And I think if anything, the pandemic and working remotely has shown, I mean, yes, we're working independently, but we're also figuring out all new ways to work together.
And you're very true in that. And one of the challenges that I've heard from multiple institutions and businesses is how do you create that sense of teamwork via Zoom? And it is one of the big challenges that employers have had. Employees are now, and this is also a generational thing, I think,
Yeah.
is millennials, Gen Z are more independent
Mhm.
and they don't necessarily affiliate with an institution. It's like me Inc. is what they say, and trying to build that teamwork, that camaraderie, that sense of loyalty to the institution has been very difficult over the last year and a half.
I can appreciate that. I also appreciate that there are different ways in which we have found new mediums to communicate with each other that we had within when we were face to face, but might have become more prominent since the pandemic. So I'm thinking about tools like Slack and Microsoft Teams, and the ways in which there is all kinds of back chatter that never used to exist at
Mhm.
organizations. And they are just, in my mind, different ways to be building coworker support and coworker connections, not in ways that the sociologist, of which I am among, might have envisioned it decades ago, but it's certainly a different time for how we conceive of what that teamwork is going to look like.
And you bring up a really interesting point because when I think back, and I'm dating myself here, when you do a complete reorganization, whether it be a university, a business, or whatever, it's very difficult to get to that same level of productivity that you had prior to because work isn't done by formal org charts. It's done by informal relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Mary knows Joe or knows Sally or
Yeah.
whoever, and you know exactly who to go to get things done, whether or not it is in their, responsibility.
Yeah.
And with the pandemic, you've had to create all new communications modes to be able to get things done. So I wonder if perhaps productivity, and I know productivity has gone up
Yeah.
since the pandemic.
Yeah.
I wonder if this is one of those outcomes that, people haven't thought about. I don't know. I'm just curious.
I was listening in on a webinar a handful of months ago, and one of the people on the webinar was a CEO at Microsoft, and or an executive at Microsoft, I should say. And he made this comment, rattled off this statistic that since the pandemic, they had been monitoring Microsoft Teams and found that the increase in the use of Teams outside of normal work hours, and particularly the weekends, had gone up 300%.
Wow.
Yeah. It's
Wow.
a stunning statistic that points directly to the skewing of boundaries and skills. Yes.
Hmm.
Yes.
Which brings us kind of to another part of your survey is personal aptitudes and mindset.
I was thinking the same thing, Drumm. I was about to say, and that's part of the reason that we asked about aptitudes and mindsets in the survey. Yeah.
And drive and work ethic top the charts this year.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the reasons for the listeners that we put that in, that was one of the unique things that we added for this time. We've never added questions specifically on exactly what you just mentioned. Things like we had asked about motivation in the 2018 survey. It was our first sort of toe in the water in this area. This time we really went after it, and we asked about things like drive and work ethic, ability to work independently and self-motivation, persistence, feeling a sense of workplace belonging. We asked about a whole list of different kinds of factors. And what we thought might happen did happen, which is that employers rank them just as highly. When you compare the top 5 mindsets and aptitudes, they are ranked just as highly as some of those top skills like teamwork and critical thinking and communication skills. We know they rank very highly for employers. And the reason we wanted to ask is because we know that they're absolutely crucial for the learning process as well. So
Mm-hmm.
we know that higher education is contributing to these skills. We wanted to draw a finer line directly to how they prepare for workplace success.
And in a few minutes, we're going to start getting into some of the details on what institutions can do to drive learning in these behaviors. But I mean, this whole personal aptitudes and mindsets, to me, this changes the whole perspective of what hiring managers look for versus what many educators say this is what you should be looking for. I mean, drive, work ethic, the ability to take initiative, self-confidence, persistence,
You got it.
self-awareness, reliance, leadership,
Yeah.
all of these, empathy. I mean, all
Yeah.
of these things, as a hiring manager, this is more a rhetorical question, is how do you assess these kind of things in an interview if someone's going to be successful? And as an educator, how do you teach these?
So let me address the first part of your question. I love that you asked this, in part because I'm an assessment person, also because it's the right thing to ask, right? One of the parts of the study that we've been tracking since about 2015 are the use of digital portfolios, electronic or e-portfolios. And these are, if for anybody who hasn't actually seen them, you can Google them. You can see lots of different formats and how they look, but they are like electronic portfolios. One way to think of them is almost like personal websites.
Mm-hmm.
But what we have tracked over time is, well, students' development of these, but really employers' interest in viewing these. And what we have seen is a substantial increase over time in employers' interest in viewing students' portfolios. And the reason that that's so important for your question is because those are the places where students actually can point to in very direct ways experiences that in which they built their confidence, experiences or papers or products or reflections in which they are actually reflecting on their sense of purpose, their sense of persistence, when they felt particularly motivated and took on a considerable amount of responsibility or persevered through failure. These are much more transparent and explicit and integrated ways to be actually able to show employers, not just tell employers, but show employers how you've been able to acquire these kinds of aptitudes. That's kind of a game changer, goes well beyond the transcript, of course, into how a student can really present themselves. It's also, quite frankly, beyond LinkedIn. And that's not a shot at LinkedIn. It's just there's a flat platform there. And the portfolios themselves are a much more dynamic way to be able to show what these skills look like.
Well, what comes to mind as you're saying this is why don't higher education institutions, when they're assigning these e-portfolios, say, we want you to make sure that you highlight these particular traits?
Yep.
So that it takes a lot of the guesswork out. I mean, you're giving the students a rubric against which employers are going to judge them, to hire them, et cetera. Why not give this to the students and say, this is what folks are looking for?
Yeah, I know. I couldn't agree more. But I think the larger context into which to place your question is to say, frankly, with any kind of learning experience, that kind of direction is helpful, whether it's an assignment or a whole first year seminar program. I mean, telling students what's expected of them is always been the bread and butter of student success. You've got to tell them what's needed to be successful in this area. It's the same with portfolios. But I could point to places like Dominican University of California, Auburn University, Boston University, LaGuardia Community College, Salt Lake City Community College. I can point to a number of places that have just done terrific and marvelous portfolio work in which students really are given that kind of direction and are producing robust, lovely portfolios that are demonstrated examples of their learning across these various areas.
Yeah. Hint for listeners, if you want to improve your hiring rate for graduates, which is certainly going to help you in your U.S. News and World Report standings, try ePortfolios.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Our biggest challenge in higher education is the efficacy, what we know about the efficacy of ePortfolios, both for learning and careers, and the relative underutilization of them as a tool.
Which kind of brings us to another interesting point about the study, the age of employers.
Mm-hmm.
And that made a difference. The younger employers and those with higher levels of education, they had a more favorable perception on the value of college degrees and graduates' preparation for work success. I mean, you take a look at us old folk, I shouldn't say us, me, old folks versus you, we look at things differently.
Yeah. Yeah. They sure did. And
sorry about that.
You were very careful, Drumm, not to call anyone old in this report. It was all about being younger and older because age is all relative. But yes, we did for the first time, one of the new things that we did find in this report, because it was the first time we'd done the analysis this way, was a consistent trend difference between employers under the age of 40 and employers over the age of 50. We had parsed it. We had employers over the age of 60, but we really found that anything over 50 and under 40 were really our biggest gaps. And so that's why the analysis is broken out that way. But yes, we found remarkable, really like stunning differences between, particularly for age. We did find consistent enough trends by higher levels of educational attainment. I'll explain those in a moment. But the age ones were striking. And what we found consistently with age was employers under the age of 40 that more highly valued any experiences related to community engagement, a focus and a goal of higher education that would attend to elements of global learning, fostering a sense of social justice, community engagement. You could see that there was definitely a kind of theme emerging that this group of employers, which were the most diverse group, both in terms of gender and race, were much more favorably viewed that level of community engagement as something that was absolutely necessary for a college degree. They were also more supportive of liberal arts education and that kind of breadth component in ways that that we look at employers in aggregate, we don't tend to see. And when we looked at employers over the age of 50, we didn't see.
Well, it's interesting, in putting on your social scientist hat, does that surprise you?
It did surprise us. But, that's where, as a sociologist, you begin to think about the demography and the differences in generations. And one of the things, in terms of conjecture and hypothesizing why we might be seeing that, we can recognize that the employers under the age of 40 are the oldest millennials. And the millennials are one of the most socially engaged generations that we've had as a country, emerging at two waves of very difficult things in our country, both the economic recession of 2008 and now this pandemic. We see, too, what's important about the millennials is it's a generation that votes with their dollars. Their manifestation of their political views will play out in the economy. It will play out in the corporations that they run and the corporations that they support. Their employer views and the idea that the millennials will become the next generation of the C-suite executives could spell something I don't want to overstate it, but says something really powerful about how we view civic engagement and community engagement within colleges and universities, and just how much more tightly the significance of that will get bound with workforce success. We know it's critical for civic success, right? And that's all about civic agency and citizenship. It's always been that, but it's going to become even tighter with workforce success.
And with economics.
No question. Absolutely. I agree.
And so we won't get into any conversations around cancel or woke culture or anything else like that. But I can see what's coming with that is the more socially engaged people are, the less they're going to put up with the things that have happened in the past that many conservatives identify with.
Yeah, I think without treading into too tricky of territory, I would say the millennials are also one of the most diverse generations that we've had, and just as our country becomes increasingly diverse, and as we think about, and it was always been reflected in our employer studies that they value teamwork, but employers especially value teamwork, and it's in the context with diverse groups of people. That's always the question. It's always been the prompt. And that's one of the things that we always want to draw out, which is there is a notion of civility in that. There is a notion of being able to listen to each other and talk with each other. Mm-hmm. And college education at its best, our campuses at their best, provide the space for those kinds of dialogues across difference.
Exactly. And so, conclusions. Were there anything there that really surprised you?
Oh, goodness, yes. Well, certainly the differences by age were one of the big take-home messages. And to acknowledge the differences that we found by educational attainment was that employers with some levels of postgraduate education tended to think like younger employers, so more open to community-based experiences, tended to value those experiences more. So that simple disaggregation, it seems like such a simple analysis, but it was a recognition that employers aren't monolithic. Employers are different, and we need to be thinking about what constructs that difference and how their perceptions might change across some fairly basic demographic factors, quite frankly. The work that we found on mindsets and aptitudes is really important in terms of how we're communicating the value of a college degree, and frankly, just all the way down to the micro level of the classroom. How as faculty do we communicate what these skills are? How do we embed these in the classroom in more robust ways? How do we help students to acknowledge when they're persisting through failure, and that it's going to be important to do those things. It's important to take agency and take ownership. These are not new concepts. The notion of self-authorship by Baxter Magolda has been around for a very long time, but we're now just connecting some really important dots in bigger ways. And that's a big take-home message. And I would say certainly the final one that wasn't a big surprise, but continues to be a validation, is employers' general support for broad transferable skills, that it's not all about technical ability. That will not be enough. It won't be enough for long-term career success. If you're going to balance that technical ability, it has to be alongside the broad skills that are going to continue to allow you to problem solve and to grow.
Those are great takeaways for it. And you touched on the real-world implications. From a president's perspective, from a provost's perspective, what do they need to be doing with the students coming through so that higher ed continues to remain relevant, so that the graduates are getting the skills that they need to be successful?
So the first thing I would say is, I don't know, are we getting into the takeaways part of
I think this is takeaways, but if we come up with more than 3, then great.
All right. Okay. This is a tricky time. You didn't need me to come on your show to say that.
Wow.
It is a tricky time.
There it is, Ashley. That's the summation of the whole thing. Thank you much.
It's
great to have you on the show.
Well, let me explain. I think it's a tricky. I was just joking earlier with a colleague, like, who would want to be a college president, right? It's a tricky time for knowing what to do. What's the right call? And it is a time of enormous resource constraint, to put it lightly, on campuses. And when the inclination is to look at your programs that tend to be in the liberal arts and tend to be in the arts and humanities, and to say, should we cut those programs because they don't have majors? I would point to this study. I would point to Georgetown's work, Georgetown Center on Education and the Workforce, to say there is tremendous ROI on those programs. There is no evidence to suggest that they do not produce the skills that are every bit as needed in the workforce as other disciplines. So this is the time to continue to think robustly about the ways in which we're providing that breadth of learning and quite frankly, providing equity for our students, that they get to choose what they want to major in and support the arts and sciences, the humanities, arts and sciences at this time. So in a time of resource constraint, I always hope that this notion of broad skills supports those disciplines rather than suggest that we should continue constraining them. Transparency is big. What we know time and time again is that these skills are relevant, they're important, but we don't equip students with the ability to talk about them. We don't equip parents to understand that this is part of the investment, is these skills. It's not just the degree, it's not just the piece of paper. It's about the skills embodied in that. Thinking about the ways in which you on your campus can translate that this is what you're about. This is what these programs are contributing to. This is what these experiences are contributing to. It's always been important. It's just never been more important to keep doing that and to make sure we're doing that for all of our students. The third thing I would mention is I think this is time to really think about the innovations between campus and industry. How do we partner with industry executives, local businesses? How are we thinking much more robustly about the conversation we can be having between our campus and community structures in ways that support and build students' sense of workplace application? We go straight to internships when we think about this stuff, and internships continue to be the coin of the realm for employers. But I think that's because that's the term they understand the best. There's no reason not to think that a community-based experience of any kind couldn't be building that. There's no reason to think that a study abroad experience couldn't be building that. A capstone or research project. We have to be thinking about how we're applying these skills because of their application to real world problems in ways that will continue to translate as workplace skills.
Yeah. What I'm hearing you say is we need to take another look at ILOs, institutional learning outcomes.
Sure. Yes. Fantastic.
And instead of saying, we're going to teach X, Y, Z or whatever programs, like, okay, how are we going to teach real world skills? Liberal arts is important. Technical is important. How can we teach them all to create a graduate who is truly ready for the workforce?
That's right. That's exactly right. And you used a endearing term, ILOs. Yes, the institutional learning outcomes. And I would hasten to add, Drumm, it's not that colleges and universities and even a group of faculty do not think they're doing these things. It's that these things tend to be implicit, and they tend to be far more implicit than the catalog of courses. So thinking about what gets forefronted and put in front of students instead of a march of credit hours towards the degree becomes a much clearer journey and path. And I don't mean to be Pollyannish and overly romanticized, but there's got to be some sort of forefronting of the journey that these courses are really about skills. And you have to develop those skills over time. And that journey towards the degree is all about skill development. It's just about making what's implicit explicit.
It is. Universities, colleges are part of the talent supply chain. And how do you give your, quote, products the skills that they need to be successful in life?
Exactly. You got it.
So what's next for you, Ashley, or AAC&U?
Well, we have some additional research on the horizon. We've just concluded a public opinion poll with Morning Consult and some of our friends at the Bipartisan Policy Center on a random sample of adults, about 2,200 adults, on how they view higher education and the skills necessary within higher education to be effective in the workforce. So it's the first time that we've ever been able to situate what we've learned from employers with just your average Joes and Janes out there to get a better understanding of how does the general public view skills. Yeah, we know there's a narrative out there about the value of higher education, But let's go a layer deeper, and let's actually see what's the general public think about this kinds of skills that are necessary, and what higher education should really be prioritizing in terms of what it does. And let's see how much daylight there is then between employers and the general public. And I think we've got some interesting findings to share.
So when's that going to be out?
That should be out hopefully this summer, hopefully in the next couple of months. And it will debut in our Liberal Education magazine.
Very good. Well, when that comes out, do let us know, and we'll have you back on to talk about that as well.
That sounds great, John. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. It's been a pleasure, and you're welcome back anytime.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening this week, and a special thank you to this week's special guest, Ashley Finley, Vice President for Research and Senior Advisor to the President at the Association of American Colleges and Universities, and for her sharing with us what employers want in college graduates. I also want to give a special shout out to our sponsor, Perdea Education. Visit PerdeaEducation.com to learn how they can help grow your online student enrollment through a performance-based model with no risk or long-term contracts to your institution. Our next guest is Dr. Dave Haney, President of Hiram College, who'll be sharing with us how Hiram has leveraged the academic prioritization and restructuring it began under its previous president, Lori Varlata, to take it to new heights. You may remember that we had Lori on as a guest about a year ago to talk about the Academic Prioritization Project, so this is a real nice follow-on. This topic is because one of our listeners, Dr. Forrest Anderson of Catawba College in North Carolina, asked to hear a follow-on to the podcast with Lori. So thank you, Forrest. And if anyone has any topics they'd like to hear, please let us know by sending me an email at podcast@changinghighered.com.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.